I was never someone easily impressed by supernatural stories. I always saw those accounts of ghosts and apparitions as mere legends, tales created to frighten or even distract children. My view of the inexplicable was quite pragmatic. I always sought rational explanations for the phenomena people call scary. However, all of that changed drastically that night when I experienced something that defies any logical explanation. I was at home, alone as usual, on a quiet night, with only the light from the television illuminating the room. Everything seemed normal until a strange sound interrupted the silence. A faint knock on the door. It wasn't just any sound. It wasn't the wind hitting the windows or any other common noise in the house. It was knocking. Soft, but rhythmic, as if someone was trying to get my attention, trying to enter. Hesitant, I stood up and walked over to the door. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see who it might be, but there was no one outside. A chill immediately ran up my spine. What should have been a relief, realizing no one was there, turned into something much stranger, a feeling of discomfort I couldn't explain. I returned to the couch, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. However, the house was eerily quiet, almost oppressive, as if something or someone was watching me. The atmosphere was dense, heavy, and the weight of the silence felt suffocating. Then the noise came again, even stranger this time. Something was being dragged down the dark hallway. It wasn't the sound of a common object. It was something being dragged slowly, almost as if it were human. A soft whisper followed that sound, something that made a shiver run down my spine. The whisper grew louder, and I could swear I heard my name being called, low and distant, yet unmistakable. My heart raced, and a wave of cold took over my body. Despite the house being small and me knowing no one was there, the feeling that something strange was present was undeniable. It was as if the air was thick with an invisible, yet tangible presence. There was no denying it. I was no longer alone. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, and all I wanted was for that feeling to disappear. I knew what was happening didn't make sense, but something told me that reality at that moment was far from normal. That's when the knocking started again. But this time, something was completely different. It didn't come from the door anymore, but from the window of my bedroom, which froze my body in fear. The sound was louder now, and for a moment I was paralyzed, unsure of what to do. Doubt overtook me. Should I go to the window or stay where I was, hoping the phenomenon would stop? But the only thing pushing me to move was the fear that if I stayed there, those knocks would never cease. With my heart pounding, I walked to the bedroom, approaching the window cautiously, and peeked through the curtain. However, there was nothing outside, but the feeling of being watched was palpable, as if someone were very close, even without showing themselves. The knocks grew in intensity, seeming to come directly from the glass, as if something were trying to break it to get in. Fear was consuming me from within, but at the same time, I couldn't understand what was happening. The sound of footsteps began echoing through the house, each step heavier and more distant. However, what disturbed me even more was that the knocks and whispers began to distort. What once seemed like a simple request for attention was now something more, something insane, almost chaotic. The knocks were getting faster and more intense, while the whispers grew more frantic, more distant, and at the same time, closer. There was no longer any doubt that I was no longer alone, and the terror of dealing with something supernatural made my stomach churn. I was being consumed by fear, and my mind began to question whether what I was hearing was real or an illusion. In a desperate act, I decided to scream, hoping the loud sound would be enough to drive away that invisible presence. But what happened was the opposite. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. There was no response, just the absolute void, as if the sound had been swallowed by the air. I tried to rationalize what was happening and ran through the house to check the doors and windows, To my surprise, they were all locked, with no sign of forced entry or any way for someone to get in. The feeling of loneliness was even more suffocating. I was alone, but how could I explain the sounds, the knocks, the whispers? The presence I felt was real, but the logical explanation simply didn't exist. Whatever was there, it shouldn't have been, and that was the most terrifying part of it all. That night, the feeling of a constant presence was like a shadow that never left me. I couldn't sleep at all, the physical exhaustion mixed with psychological agony as I sat there, hoping that whatever it was that was haunting me would just disappear. But it didn't. Every attempt to relax was met with the sound of breathing, low and heavy, as if someone were right beside me, breathing in my direction. I looked at the corners of the room, trying to find some logical explanation, something that could reassure me and dissipate that unbearable fear. But there was nothing. The corners were empty, the furniture lifeless, and all that remained was a growing cold that spread through every inch of the house. The atmosphere became heavier, as if the air itself had thickened, making it harder to breathe. When dawn finally arrived, bringing a soft light through the windows, the house seemed quieter, but the feeling of emptiness and fear was still there, lingering in the air. It was as if whatever had visited my home that night was still present, waiting for the right moment to return. There were no more noises or whispers, but the feeling of being watched never fully dissipated. I found myself paralyzed by doubt, questioning my sanity, my understanding of what was real and what wasn't. The peace that the day brought was only superficial, and I knew that the next night could bring the return of that inexplicable presence. Since then, something inside me has changed. I am no longer the same person I was before that night. What happened in that house remains a mystery to me, and the feeling that something is watching, monitoring me, has never left. Every night the fear grows once again, and the question continues to haunt me. Did it return? Or has that feeling, that presence, always been there, patiently waiting for the moment to find me again? I don't have the answer, but I know that somehow I will never truly be alone again. It was an ordinary night, but in a strange way, something felt different. I was at home alone after an exhausting day at work. The lights were off, and the only source of light was the television, which I had left on while I tried to relax and forget the stress. The clock had already passed midnight when a sound that didn't belong to the environment stood out. It came from the front door, but it wasn't just the usual creaks and cracks of an old house. It was a peculiar noise, something like a firm knock on wood, clear and sharp. My body instantly reacted to that oddity. I got up and went to the door, but when I opened it, there was nothing there. It must have been the wind, I thought, trying to convince myself it was something trivial. I returned to the couch, but an uncomfortable sensation began to creep over me, as if I were being watched. I wasn't as calm as I had been before. A few minutes later, the noise repeated, now louder and more insistent. Someone was knocking at the door as if they were trying to get my attention, or worse, as if they wanted to come in. My heart raced, and a cold sensation ran down my spine. Something was wrong, and I knew it, but I couldn't explain what it was. The lights in the room began to flicker, alternating between moments of darkness and brief flashes. The sound of footsteps on the porch, as if someone was circling around the house, was enough to freeze me in place. A strong urge to run took over me, but there was an invisible force that prevented me from moving. It was as if fear had trapped me, and every part of me knew I could no longer ignore what was happening. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I didn't know what to do. Reluctantly, but with an uncontrollable impulse, I went to the window and looked outside, searching for any clue of what was going on. The outside was swallowed by the darkness of the night, with no signs of movement or any human presence in sight. The calm of the street contrasted with the whirlwind of sensations I was experiencing inside the house. No shadows, no sounds, just the stillness of the deep night. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but the feeling that something was out there, waiting, grew stronger. My eyes scanned the darkness as my mind wondered, who was watching me? Or was it something else? Something I couldn't comprehend. Then something happened. A voice, soft and almost harmless, but as clear as crystal, broke the silence of the house. "Let me in," it whispered, and the feeling of cold was instant. It was as if it were whispering directly into my ear, even though I knew I was completely alone. My body froze, and a wave of terror took over me. There was no one there, no one but me. But the voice, the clear presence of something that shouldn't be there, made me doubt everything around me. The fear was quick, but it soon turned into irrational anger. "Who's messing with me?" I shouted with all my might, the rage burning in my chest. But, as expected, there was no answer. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I went down the hallway, and the house seemed normal, as if nothing had happened. The lights had stopped flickering, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Something was definitely wrong. I knew that now. I could no longer ignore it. Desperate, I made a decision. Leave the house. I grabbed my keys, opened the door, and took a step outside. But as soon as I did, the air around me seemed to change. Denser, as if something was trying to pull me back inside. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to shake off the weight that suffocated me, and took a deep breath. When I opened my eyes again, my body stopped functioning for a moment. On the stairs, right in front of me, there was something. Someone. It didn't look human. The silhouette was indistinct, a dark shadow, with no defined shape, like a stain in space. The gaze was empty, as if there were no life, as if it were just an echo of something that no longer belonged to the world of the living. My throat tightened, and my breath became difficult, as if the air had been taken from me. Fear took over my entire body, and I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask, but the figure remained silent, not moving an inch. It was just there, standing still with that vacant, penetrating stare, as if it was waiting for something from me. Time seemed to stop, and a sense of helplessness consumed me. I didn't know what to do. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to escape, but fear paralyzed me. That presence on the stairs was beyond any explanation. Something told me that if I looked again, everything would change. But what else could happen? What did that thing want from me? I was completely at the mercy of something I didn't understand. Suddenly, the atmosphere around me grew even denser. The air seemed to weigh down on my shoulders, and the figure began to move toward me with an unsettling slowness. Each step it took was filled with a tension that was impossible to ignore, and no matter how much I wanted to run, scream, or even move away, my body didn't respond. The words I wanted to shout simply wouldn't come out. My throat was dry, and the paralysis of fear overtook me. When the figure came even closer, just a few meters away, a wave of icy cold enveloped me, as if time had stagnated for a second. The air was so cold that I could feel my bones ache. Then, the figure, with a voice almost inaudible but so clear and sharp I couldn't help but hear it, whispered, "I warned you. You shouldn't be here." Those words cut through the air, and in the instant they left its mouth, everything around me seemed to collapse, as if the very world I knew was disintegrating. The house that once seemed familiar turned into a completely strange place, as if the environment had been distorted, made to trap me there in an endless nightmare. Fear overwhelmed me in a way that was far deeper than any terror I had ever felt. It was as if I was in a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. I don't remember how I managed to get out of the house, how my feet carried me away from that nightmare. But when I woke up, the street was quiet, the early morning moved on without haste, and the house looked normal. That place that had once terrified me now seemed calm, with no traces of anything abnormal. The facade was intact, as if nothing had happened, as if everything had been just an illusion. However, inside me, I knew that calm was a lie. The feeling that something was wrong, that there was something more behind it all, didn't leave me. I knew this wasn't the end. That presence, that dark figure, wasn't something that would just disappear. Something much more sinister was still to come, and I was somehow connected to it. Sometimes I still hear the noises. They're subtle at first, but as clear as before. Knocks on the door as if someone is out there, waiting, wanting to come in. I can't ignore it anymore. I know that presence won't leave, and with each passing night, I feel that it's getting closer.